1. Intro. The night Clara left, Ethan didn't find a goodbye note. He found her wedding ring sealed inside an envelope, and one sentence that made him sit down on the floor. I stayed loyal because I thought your pain still needed me. For 11 years, he believed Clara was the kind of woman who would never leave. Quiet, patient, forgiving, the woman who reheated dinner after his silence, smiled through his coldness, and loved him even when he gave her nothing soft to hold. But what Ethan never knew was this. Clara had already been grieving him while sleeping beside him. Every night, she wrote letters he never read. Every morning, she folded her heartbreak into kindness. And by the time he finally noticed her silence, her love had already packed its bags. This is not a story about betrayal. It is a story about the kind of loyalty that dies slowly, when no one protects it. Before we continue, subscribe to the Hidden Angle podcast channel. 2. Setup. When Ethan first met Clara, she laughed with her whole heart. Not the kind of laugh people fake at crowded dinners or polite conversations. Her laughter felt warm, unguarded, like someone who still believed people could be gentle with each other. Back then, Ethan was different too. He used to reach for her hand at red lights. Used to leave small notes inside her books. Used to whisper, "Thank you," every time she stayed up waiting for him after long shifts at work. But life has a quiet way of changing people without asking permission. Years passed. The apartment grew quieter. Conversations became shorter. Ethan buried himself in deadlines, exhaustion, and the kind of emotional numbness he never learned how to explain. He stopped noticing the little things first. He stopped noticing Clara brushing tears away while washing dishes. Stopped noticing how she stared at him during dinner, waiting for him to ask how her day was. Stopped noticing that she had started sleeping closer to the edge of the bed. And Clara never complained loudly. That was the tragedy. She loved in silence. When Ethan forgot anniversaries, she smiled and said it was okay. When he came home emotionally distant, she still warmed his food. When he answered her kindness with distracted nods, she convinced herself he was simply tired, not drifting away. Everyone around her told her the same thing. You deserve better. But Clara never measured love by what she received. She measured it by what she was willing to protect. What nobody understood was that Ethan had once shown her the most broken version of himself. Years ago, on a rainy night, he admitted something he had never told another soul. I think people eventually leave when they see the real me. Clara remembered those words long after Ethan forgot saying them. So she stayed. Not because she was weak. Not because she feared loneliness. But because she believed love meant holding someone gently while they fought invisible battles. The problem was, Ethan slowly stopped fighting. And Clara slowly started disappearing. She stopped painting. Stopped singing while making coffee in the mornings. Stopped calling her friends back. The woman who once filled rooms with warmth began moving through life like a guest inside her own marriage. Some nights, Ethan would wake up at 2 a.m. and find Clara sitting alone in the living room, staring into darkness with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He never asked why. And eventually, she stopped hoping he would. The cruelest part about emotional distance is that it rarely arrives like a storm. It arrives quietly. In delayed replies. In tired eyes. In affection becoming routine instead of intentional. And by the time one person realizes the relationship is fading, the other has already been mourning it for years. 3. Emotional build. Clara became an expert at hiding sadness in ordinary moments. She hid it in the way she smiled when Ethan barely looked up from his phone. In the way she quietly cleaned the kitchen after eating dinner alone at the table meant for two. In the way she said, "I'm fine," with a softness that sounded more like surrender every passing month. At first, she told herself this phase would pass. People get tired, relationships become busy, love changes shape over time. That's what she believed. So she kept trying. She started waking up earlier just to make Ethan coffee exactly the way he liked it. She left small handwritten notes in his coat pockets before work. Tiny reminders that someone still cared deeply about him. Drive safe. Don't skip lunch. I'm proud of you. Most days, Ethan never mentioned the notes. Sometimes, Clara found them crumpled in the laundry basket at the end of the week. Still, she kept writing them. Because loving Ethan had become less about receiving love back and more about protecting the fragile pieces of him she once fell in love with. But loneliness does something dangerous when it stays too long inside a person. It starts making silence feel normal. One evening, Clara sat beside Ethan on the couch while rain tapped softly against the apartment windows. She rested her head gently on his shoulder, searching for warmth that used to exist naturally between them. Ethan didn't move, didn't hold her hand, didn't even notice she was quietly crying beside him. He simply kept scrolling through his phone while the woman who loved him tried not to break apart inches away.
Talk to me.
That was the night something inside Clara changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly, like a candle running out of oxygen. After that, she stopped asking Ethan if he wanted to spend time together. Stopped asking if he still loved her. Stopped asking if anything was wrong. Because deep down, she already knew the answer people fear the most. You can feel alone even beside the person you love. Weeks later, Clara began attending grief counseling sessions in secret. Not because someone had died, but because she felt like her relationship was disappearing slowly in front of her eyes. And she didn't know how to save it alone anymore. The counselor once asked her a question that left Clara speechless. When was the last time someone took care of you? Clara smiled politely, then burst into tears, because she genuinely couldn't remember. At home, Ethan noticed Clara becoming quieter, but he mistook her silence for peace. He thought the lack of arguments meant the relationship was stable. He never understood that some women stop fighting when they become emotionally exhausted. Not because they stopped loving you, but because loving you started hurting more than losing you. And Clara was tired. Tired of carrying conversations alone. Tired of begging for emotional crumbs. Tired of pretending loyalty did not have limits. Yet every night before sleeping, she still looked at Ethan the same way she had years ago. Like she was hoping the man she fell in love with would somehow return. The heartbreaking part was this. Ethan still loved Clara in his own broken way. He just became too emotionally disconnected to show it before her heart finally gave up waiting. 4. Conflict. The final cracks in their marriage did not come from screaming fights. They came from small moments Ethan barely remembered, but Clara never forgot. Like the night she waited 3 hours at a restaurant for their anniversary dinner while Ethan answered work emails in his office downtown. He texted her only once. Something came up, don't wait. But she had already ordered his favorite meal. The candle melted down completely before she finally asked for the check alone. When Clara returned home that night, Ethan was sitting on the couch watching television as if nothing important had happened. I said not to wait, he told her casually. And something inside Clara shattered quietly. Because she realized the problem was no longer the missed dinner. It was the fact that Ethan could no longer recognize her pain even while looking directly at it. After that night, their apartment stopped feeling like a home. It became a place where two exhausted people simply existed beside each other. Ethan noticed Clara speaking less, but instead of getting closer, he pulled further away. Every conversation felt heavy to him. Every emotional discussion sounded like criticism. So he escaped into work, headphones, late night scrolling, anything that required less vulnerability than facing the woman he loved. Meanwhile, Clara was drowning silently. One afternoon, she found herself standing in the grocery store staring blankly at Ethan's favorite cereal. Suddenly wondering why she continued memorizing the preferences of a man who no longer noticed her existence. That thought terrified her. Because Clara had spent years believing loyalty meant endurance. But now, for the first time, she wondered if loyalty could slowly become self-destruction. The tension between them grew colder each week. One night, Clara finally asked the question she had been swallowing for months. Do you even see me anymore? Ethan sighed immediately, exhausted before the conversation even began. Why do you always make things emotional? Those words hit Clara harder than shouting ever could. Because she realized Ethan no longer saw her feelings as something precious. He saw them as inconvenience. And once love starts feeling inconvenient, people stop handling each other gently. That same night, Clara locked herself in the bathroom and cried with both hands covering her mouth so Ethan wouldn't hear her breaking apart only a few feet away. But he did hear her. He just didn't go after her. That became the moment Clara emotionally let go of the marriage, even though her body still stayed. Days later, Ethan noticed something strange. Clara stopped expecting anything from him. No more disappointed expressions. No more emotional conversations. No more attempts to fix them. She became calm. Too calm. And people often mistake emotional detachment for healing, when sometimes it is simply the final stage before goodbye. Then came the moment Ethan would replay in his mind for years. One rainy morning, Clara accidentally left her notebook open on the kitchen counter before leaving for therapy. Ethan normally would not have looked. But one sentence caught his attention. I miss the man he used to be, but I think I've been grieving him alone for years. He froze. For the first time in a very long time, Ethan felt fear. Not fear of losing the relationship. Fear that he had already lost it, and simply noticed too late. 5. Hidden truth. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the sentence he found in Clara's notebook. I think I've been grieving him alone for years. At first, he wanted to believe it was written during a bad day, a temporary emotional moment, something dramatic people write when they're overwhelmed. But deep down, he knew better. Because for the first time in years, Ethan started noticing the details he had ignored. The untouched cups of coffee Clara made for herself every morning. The way she paused outside their apartment door before coming inside, as if preparing herself emotionally to enter a place that no longer felt safe. The way her smile disappeared the second he looked away. And suddenly, memories began returning to him differently. Not as ordinary moments, but as warnings he failed to hear. One evening, after Clara fell asleep on the couch, Ethan quietly searched for the counseling center listed on one of her appointment cards. He told himself he only wanted answers. But the truth was far uglier. He wanted proof that Clara had exaggerated her pain. Instead, he found Mara Ellis, Clara's grief counselor. Mara recognized Ethan immediately the moment he walked into her office. Not with anger, not even surprise. Just sadness. The kind of sadness people carry when they already know how a story ends. You finally came, Mara said softly. Ethan sat down slowly, uncomfortable under the weight of her calm silence. I think my wife is unhappy, he admitted quietly. Mara looked at him for a long moment before speaking. No, she said gently. Your wife was unhappy years ago. Those words landed like a knife. For nearly an hour, Ethan listened while Mara carefully revealed truths Clara never had the strength to say aloud at home. Clara wasn't attending grief counseling because she wanted to leave him. She attended because she desperately wanted to stay, without losing herself completely. She kept defending you, Mara explained softly, even during the sessions where she cried the hardest. Ethan lowered his eyes. Mara continued. She said you weren't cruel, just emotionally lost, and that made it harder for her to hate you. That sentence shattered something inside him. Because Ethan realized Clara had spent years protecting his image while silently drowning beside him. Then Mara opened a folder from her desk. Inside were letters Clara had written during therapy sessions. Letters she never intended Ethan to read. Mara hesitated before handing him one. She wrote this after your anniversary dinner, she whispered. Ethan unfolded the paper carefully with trembling hands. The letter read, I keep mourning someone who is still alive. And somehow that hurts more. Because every morning I wake up hoping he'll come back to me emotionally. And every night I realize I'm sleeping beside a stranger who still wears my husband's face. Ethan stopped breathing for a moment. His chest tightened so hard it physically hurt. For years, he thought loyalty meant Clara would simply never leave. He never understood the hidden truth. Loyal people leave too. They just leave slowly. Piece by piece. After giving everything they had. And the most devastating part of all, Clara never stopped loving him. She simply became exhausted from loving him alone. 6. Twist. 3 days after meeting Mara, Ethan came home earlier than usual. For the first time in years, he noticed how painfully quiet the apartment sounded without Clara trying to fill the emptiness. No soft music from the kitchen. No scent of coffee drifting through the hallway. No gentle voice asking whether he had eaten yet. Just silence. The kind that forces a person to finally hear their own guilt. Ethan walked slowly through the apartment, touching pieces of a life he suddenly realized Clara had been carrying almost entirely by herself. The framed photos she dusted every weekend. The dying plant near the window she kept trying to save. The stack of unopened books she once begged him to read with her. Every corner of the home carried evidence of her effort. And every corner reminded him how little he had noticed. Then he saw it. A small cardboard box sitting beside the closet. Neatly sealed. His name written on top in Clara's handwriting. Ethan's chest tightened as he opened it carefully. Inside were hundreds of tiny things he barely remembered. Movie tickets from their first date. Receipts from late-night diners. Birthday cards. Polaroid photos. Even the stupid little paper crane he folded for Clara years ago while waiting at an airport. At the bottom of the box sat one final envelope. His hands shook opening it. Inside was a voice recorder. Ethan pressed play. At first, there was only silence. Then Clara's voice filled the room softly. "If you're hearing this, I finally left." Ethan stopped breathing. Her voice sounded calm, not angry, not bitter. Just tired. "I need you to know something before you blame yourself too much." She continued, "You were not a monster, Ethan." His eyes filled instantly. "You were just someone who stopped noticing they were loved." Tears rolled down his face before he could stop them. Clara took a slow breath on the recording. "I kept waiting for you to see me again. Not as your routine, not as the person who would always stay, but as the woman who once made you feel safe enough to cry." Ethan covered his mouth, shoulders shaking. Then came the sentence that destroyed him completely. "The saddest part is, I would have stayed if you had reached for me even once." Silence. A long, painful silence. Then Clara spoke one final time. "You asked me years ago why I loved you so much." Another pause. "It was because I saw the frightened little boy inside you before anyone else did." Ethan collapsed onto the floor crying. Because suddenly, he understood the truth Clara had protected all along. She was never loyal to his mistakes. She was loyal to the wounded version of him that existed underneath them. And he had spent years punishing the only person who truly saw him. The twist was never that Clara stopped loving Ethan. The twist was that she loved him deeply until the very end. While slowly realizing love cannot survive when only one person keeps choosing it. And for the first time in his life, Ethan understood something terrifying. Sometimes people do not leave because they stopped loving you. They leave because staying became the thing that destroyed them. 7. Resolution. Ethan never chased Clara that night. Not because he didn't want to. Because for the first time, he understood that love is not proven by panic after someone leaves. It is proven in the quiet days when they are still standing beside you, hoping to be chosen. Weeks later, Clara moved into a small apartment with morning light, white curtains, and silence that no longer hurt her. She still cried sometimes. Healing did not arrive like a miracle. It arrived slowly, in clean sheets, warm tea, unanswered phone calls, and the first morning she woke up without reaching for someone who had already been gone for years. Ethan kept her voice recorder in his desk drawer. Some nights, he played it once, not to punish himself, but to remember. Clara had not left to destroy him. She left to save herself. And maybe that was the final act of love he never deserved. Because some people do not come back. They become the lesson. If this story touched something in you, comment, like, share, and subscribe to the Hidden Angle podcast channel.